Welcome, brothers and sisters from Westside. We're in our study of the patriarchs in Genesis chapters 12 through 50. We have covered, of course, Abraham and Isaac, and now we come into the life of Jacob, as we have already seen his stay in Padan Aram for the past 20 years. 14 of those years he served Laban for his wives, Leah and Rachel. And then the final 6 years was God transferring the flocks and herds of Laban over to Jacob by blessing, no matter how many times Laban changed. And Jacob says it was 10 times. If that just means a rounded number, if you just kept changing it all the time to the fullest extent, or exactly 10 times, it can be either way uh, looked at in the scriptures. But nonetheless, Laban had tried to cheat him, and yet God had blessed him. And so he had basically taken all of the wealth of Laban, or at least a very significant portion of it, and it had become Jacob's. As God said, I will bless you, and the one that curses you, which of course ends up being men like Laban who wanted to do him harm. And today we come, of course, to his fear of Esau. We covered the story of how Laban pursued him and their departure or their separation from one another. And so now he has to turn his attention as he's approaching the Canaan from the north as he's traveling toward that land. He has to send word to Esau. But before that happens, a very interesting statement is made in verses 1 and 2. Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." And so he called the name of that place Mahanaim. And so that means double camp or two camps. So apparently there was a group of angels, an encampment of angels that were following Jacob, sort of paralleling him, so that he calls them double camp. Now, how he knows they're angels, we are not told. This is not, I think, to be understood as just some kind of human messenger. As you know, the word angel simply means messenger. The Greek word is angelos. You hear our word angel, so angel, we just borrowed it directly from the Greek. And in both Hebrew and Greek, it is just the idea of a messenger. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're celestial beings. They are created by God too, as we know from Scripture, but they are greater. Man is made a little lower, the psalmist says, than the angels. The angels have immense power, as we see on one occasion them slaying a whole Assyrian army that had assembled before the gates of Jerusalem in the days of Hezekiah. So again, we're not told how he knows, but he knows, and he's very much impressed. And I do not think these are just messengers of men, these are messengers of God. These are angels as we understand them. And I think that bears into the story as we get into it. So Jacob at that point then sends messengers to his brother Esau and to tell him that he is coming. He sends them all the way to Seir, which is the home country of Edom, which are the people of the descendants of Esau's time will come. And he tells them, I have many herds, ox, donkeys, male servants, female servants, and I am coming to tell my Lord that I may find favor in your sight. The only response he gets at verse 6 is the messengers return to Jacob, and they say, we came to your brother Esau, and he's coming to meet you, and there are 400 men with him. So what would you think? The last word that he had received was Rebekah's, and for as far as we know, the last time that he ever heard from his mother. She had told him to go away in chapter 27, verse 45, to her brother Laban in Padan Aram until the anger of his brother Esau subsided. But we never see any other response from Rebekah going to Jacob to call him back. This has been all done by God telling Jacob to come back after those 20 years, which he brings his many children. One will be born on the way into Canaan, as we will see later in the story on the second part of our lesson. But now Esau just doesn't even respond with words. And what would you think? If he's coming with 400 armed men, his last words to you was, I'm going to murder him after our father dies. And so Jacob can only think that these are armed men and they're coming to attack everything that Jacob has. Nothing could be more ominous than Esau's silence and his rapid approach in force, so says Kidner in his commentary. So Jacob divides his people into two camps. Interesting that the angels had been called that. is something that Jacob is doing, and that is, if Esau attacks one side, then the other side would probably put at a great distance, could escape, would have the time to escape while they were engaged in battle with the other. And Jacob is, of course, providing, and the scriptures never says this is wrong unless we substitute it for God, unless we trust in our own devices. He is going to trust in God, as his prayer will indicate. But his fear causes him to do things that he probably should have just understood by the very encounter with the angels. The fact that they were paralleling him, that God had told him to go back to the land, should have been the confidence he had that God was going to take care of him. But I know if I heard that a man who hated me so much that he had vowed to kill me was coming with me with 400 armed men, I would have behaved exactly as Jacob did. I think you would too. You would do the best. You can't flee from him without losing every ounce of your wealth, the animals that you have. There's no way to get away. If he couldn't get away from Laban, how's he going to get away from Esau? And so he does what he can, even though God is going to protect him as he protected him from Laban. And so at verse 9, great prayer that Jacob prays, he says, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, he uses the name Yahweh, who said to me, Return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love. That very common word in Old Testament scripture. I think it occurs 250 plus times. The faithful love of God, always a covenant concept that the overlord will take care of the vassal, that God, the great God that made the covenant with Abraham and Isaac, will take care of his underlings, of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And so he prays that I do not even deserve the least of what you can do. But you have shown me your steadfast love and faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with my staff only I crossed the Jordan, and now I have become two camps. Again, that reference that makes you wonder why that doesn't tie into his mind. That he had called the camps of the angels. So God is protecting him. God is watching over him. Please deliver me from my hand of my brother Esau, that he will not attack the children and the mothers. But you said, I will surely do you good, verse 12, and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. So that one great point of the covenant that God would bless Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob with a great offspring in number. That was one of the 3 points of the great covenant that was made. And this is what he alludes to. If he kills the children, kills the mothers, or takes them into captivity, kills Jacob, then all of that is destroyed. So Jacob is relying upon God by his prayer. He's doing what he can do. And so we are told then that in the next verses that he gives a great multitude of animals, 550 total head of livestock. And he sends out goats, and he sends out sheep, and he sends out cows, and he sends out camels, and he sends out both female and male of most of the species. And then he puts a great distance between each of the herders, the servants. And he said, when you come and you're passing on, and Esau comes and meets you and says, to whom do you belong, and where are you going, and who's are ahead of thee? And he said, These belong to your servant Jacob. They are a present sent to my lord Esau, and moreover, he is behind me. And by this, Jacob said, I may appease his wrath, so that when he sees my face, and that's always an important concept, to lift the face to one, was be able to look them in the eye and not in shame. Perhaps he will accept me. And so he's trying to soften Esau up. And in effect, the word propitiation that we learn in the New Testament, that means to appease, to soften the anger, the wrath of one who rightfully is angered against another. And then we are told that he passes on over the Jabbok. He's on the other side of the Jordan. He's not on the Canaan side that we know of, the land of Israel, but on the other side, on the western side. I'm sorry, on the eastern side of Jordan. And that same night, he separates all his family and puts them on one side, and then he is by himself. And then this most amazing part of the story happens, and we want to pick that up and read it together. And so Jacob was left alone, verse 24, and just immediately, it seems, it says to us, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. What would you think is in all this terrible angst that you have for Esau, and then in the middle of the night, in the darkness of the night, a man attacks you? I mean, can you imagine that Jacob was thinking this is some kind of spy sent from Jacob? I'm sorry, sent from Esau to attack Jacob. And so, how would you think they're wrestling? You know, sometimes brothers growing up with one another wrestle with one another. I doubt to try to kill each other. Do you think Jacob was just wrestling with this guy in good nature, or he was trying to harm this man? He was trying to totally disable him, in effect, kill him if he had to, because he would assume that this is somebody sent by Esau to harm his family, and as a man would be a man to defend his family. And when the man, the one that Jacob's wrestling with, saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Now think how that would have changed the whole of this story. Who is this man that Jacob is wrestling with? In the verses that will follow, it's evident that God has taken on human form, I believe, that he has taken on human form as he has done before with Abraham. Remember when he appeared to him, and the other two were angels, and they went on to the city to preserve Lot and to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. The one that would remain of the three is God, and identifies himself as Yahweh, and Abraham understands that. Here in this story, I think the same is true. Verse 28, then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men. So the one that he is striving with now is God that has manifested himself in flesh. And then at verse 30, so Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, meaning I have seen the face of God. The face of God is what Peniel means. And so I have seen the face of God, and yet my life has been delivered. If Jacob had known he was wrestling with Yahweh, he would never have started it. To see the face of God in all of Scripture is a death sentence. In fact, God will say that later on in the story of Exodus of Moses. No man can see my face and live. I believe it's in Exodus 34, but there's a lot of different places. Remember when the parents of Samson believe they've seen the face of God. His wife has to say, if God wanted to kill us, he had good chance to do it. But there's always that great fear of seeing God's face. And so I cannot imagine Jacob would have wrestled with this man had he known his true identity when he was wrestling with him. Now, Hosea makes an interesting point. Hundreds and hundreds of years later, Hosea will write in chapter 12 of his book, verses 3 and 4, that it was an angel of the Lord but he also identifies him as God too. You can read that passage of verse 3 and 4. Would seem to suggest that it is again the angel with a capital A, the one we have met before and will meet again. That seems to be, probably as we know in the New Testament, that we come to know as Jesus, the one of the Godhead that identifies himself that way, the one that followed them in the wilderness, and all of that issue that you can study on your own. But obviously, the one that is wrestling with him has to be God as we're thinking about it. And so think about that in just a moment, in a second, this whole thing has changed. God has brought himself down to some equal plane with Jacob, that Jacob in his strength and his tenacity and his obstinacy and the way that we have seen him wrestle with so many others, men, Esau and Laban, for instance, and now he wrestles with God, or this one that he thinks is a man, the same way, and yet with just the touch of his finger. His hip socket is thrown out of joint, and no longer could he wrestle. No longer could it be that he could prevail against him. And yet the man says to him at verse 26, let me go, for the day has broken. They wrestle all through whatever the part of the night he attacked him. On to daybreak, and just before daybreak, the angel or God does this to him. And in a moment, the whole thing is changed. The man did not have to ask for Jacob to let him go. If he has disabled him with but the touch of his finger, he could have crushed Jacob if he had wanted to. Jacob says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. That is, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. And I believe the first meaning of that, Israel, El, remember, means God. You have striven with God is what that name means. Now, yes, it can mean striven with man, but because of the El in it, I believe it is referencing God. And so here's another indication that he is dealing with God. The lesser, Hebrews 7 and verse 7, the lesser is always blessed of the greater. Remember that happened in Abraham when he came with Melchizedek. It was Melchizedek that blessed Abraham, and Abraham paid tithes to all of tenth of all he had to Melchizedek because he was greater than Abraham. And so in this very story, we have that same thing that the blessing comes from this man to Jacob, which means Jacob is under him. The other is that he asked Jacob's name. The one who obviously is victorious, has the power, has the right to ask someone's name or who they are, whatever they want to know. And when Jacob asked him, Jacob then said, please tell me your name. He said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him, it says at that point. To render his name, to give up one's name, would be tantamount to submission in this story. Jacob's had to give up his name to the one who has been victorious over him, but he will not give up his name. And of course, how he identifies himself in so many places. I am that I am. My name is wonderful. There are so many ways that Yahweh has identified himself, but he does not on this occasion, signifying the greatness of the one that is dealing with Jacob. And there he blessed him. And so Jacob called the place of the Peniel, meaning, for I have seen God face to face, and my life has been delivered. Now remember, he seeks deliverance from Esau, but now he has been delivered from the face of God. That God, who could have judged him and destroyed him as easily as the touch in the hip socket, now why should he fear his brother, to see the face of his brother? For God has delivered him, and he has seen the face of God. Imagine the wrestling that Jacob has been through in his life. His entire life has been that, grabbing the heel of Esau as he came out in birth, wrestling with him for the birthright, and ultimately stealing the blessing from Israel, wrestling with Laban all of those years for his daughters and his flocks. And now he wrestles with God. But here is where Jacob, the man that we've known, the deceiver, the supplanter, the conniver, now by faith that has grown, becomes Israel, becomes the one who trusts in God and will trust in him more and more. And so the great story that is told here is one that we need to put our faith and our confidence in. That passage that no man can see God's face and live, by the way, is Exodus 33 and verse 20. And the one with Abraham and Melchizedek is Genesis 14, 18 through 20. And I think I told you Hebrews 7 and 7, that the lesser is blessed of the greater. All right, so he does one other thing which is fascinating in this story, and that is that he limps away. When the sun rose upon him at Peniel, he limped away because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. It may be in light of this Israelite practice that it tells us that to this day, Moses is writing that hundreds of years later, saying that Israel continues to not eat that particular part of what covers the thigh there, or the hip bone of an animal, because that's where his hip was dislocated. That may be, and most likely, Jacob's hip, rather, he limped the rest of his life. That there was a permanent mark placed upon him by God, showing that although in one sense he had striven with God and prevailed, God left his mark on him, that he was never self-sufficient, and he would never be self-sufficient, that he must always rely upon God. And it would seem to be that's why, because if Jacob just healed up later, maybe from the greatness of the story, that's why they do not, because he dislocated his hip, but most likely because he continued to bear that mark the rest of his life. And so the next morning, Jacob lifts his eyes and looks, and behold, Esau was coming with the 400 men. He divided now his children into Leah and Rachel and the handmaids. He puts the handmaids and their children first, then Leah and her children, and last of all, of course, Rachel and Joseph. Again, the turmoil in his family, he's showing who is the favorite. It's going to play into the story of Joseph in a disastrous way. But Jacob is showing that order of who he prefers. And he himself, it says at verse 3, went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near his brother. Imagine that. As he approaches, bows his face all the way to the ground. Then he gets up, comes a little further, and bows himself all the way to the ground. The Amarna tablets and the Eucharistic documents, these are two places where a lot of those clay tablets have been discovered in the ancient Near East, tell us that this was the customary approach to a king, 7 being that perfect number in Scripture and in the wider understanding of the time. Bowing 7 times would be the way an underlord, a vassal, would approach that overlord, the king. And so Jacob is showing his submission and acknowledging Esau's greatness. And then Esau, just in this simple response, tells Jacob he has nothing to fear. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. So again, Jacob must have been a little bit of distance away when the final of the 7 times occurs, because it says that Esau ran to him. So he hasn't come right up to Esau. Esau runs to him and embraces him. And as Kidner said in his commentary, guilt and forgiveness are so eloquent in every movement of the mutual approach of Esau and Jacob to each other. So Esau forgives him, obviously. And in verse 10, Jacob says, "For I've seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God." Remember already what we have been talking about. But if he has been delivered from the face of God, he has nothing to fear from the face of Esau. Esau held over Jacob the power of life and death. He could have destroyed him with those 400 men if God didn't intervene. But is a reflection of his divine mercy, of God's divine mercy. Esau stands in some way in the place of God as Jacob bows down and pleads for mercy, and Esau is pacified as we and Jacob and all others must pacify God's propitiation, that anger of God at our sin, and the righteous anger of God as our sin, the righteous anger that Esau had against Jacob. And Jacob offers tribute to his overlord by giving him all the gifts of those animals in the same way we offer our worship and our submission to God to be pleasing unto him. And so we are told that Esau wanted to, again, in his kindness and in the fact that they had made up, go along with Jacob on his journey, again, maybe as protection. But then when he says, "I have lots of the women, the children, they're going to slow us down, slow you down. Well, let me leave some of the people with you." And he said, "No." And so finally Esau relents. He takes the animals that he has given him and goes off. So Esau obviously is going to be, thinking in terms of, if you go out to battle, you're going to come back with a lot of goods and animals that you would have gotten from your raid, and he's getting it all in peace and goes away from Jacob. Jacob comes to a place that he names Succoth, or booths. He makes temporary tents and places for the livestock pens where they can. Again, he's on the eastern side. He will cross almost directly across the Jordan at that place and go to Shechem. And Shechem's going to play a big role in the story that we'll tell the next 2 chapters that I'll get out to you on Friday. And there at that place, he erects an altar. So the first altar of him returning to the land of Canaan. And he names it El Elohi Israel. And that means God, the God of Israel. And so he calls himself by that name now. There's going to be another naming God does with him, which firmly fixes it now. We'll still see the name Jacob from time to time, but Israel, of which the whole people, the nation that descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, will be known. All right, thank you for your attention, and hope you had a good study in this passage, and we will come back to you with chapters 34 and 35 video on Friday.